Since the creation of the United States in 1776, the right to vote has evolved tremendously.
Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
It started 12 years later, in 1787, when the U.S. Constitution was ratified and left the voting rights to the states, and the only people with voting access were white male property owners. Then, 3 years later, the Naturalization Act of 1790 gave all white men, regardless if they were property owners or not, the right to vote. Fast forward a staggering 80 years later, when in 1870, the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was passed, which prohibited denying the right to vote based on race for men only. This amendment, however, was not accepted in the South, and in the late 19th century, Jim Crow laws were implemented in the southern part of the United States, and the path to the ballot for African Americans was compromised. With Jim Crow laws running rampant and widespread hatred and violence toward African Americans vividly present in the South, steps toward equal voting rights were taken to give Black Americans hope. In the early to the middle part of the 20th century, many steps were taken by activists in the United States to give African Americans a fair vote.
Shaping up now for tomorrow.
Things are shaping up beautifully. We have people coming in from all over the country. I suspect that we will have representatives from almost every state in the Union, and naturally a large number of people from the state of Alabama. And we hope to see, and we plan to see, the greatest witness for freedom that has ever taken place on the steps of the capital of any state in the South. And this whole march adds drama to this total struggle.
It started in 1915 with the ruling in Gwynn v. the United States, which made grandfather clauses, which was used as a way to discourage African Americans into not voting, ruled as unconstitutional under the protections of the 15th Amendment. Then, 5 years later, the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was passed, which gave women the right to vote. And all of a sudden, things were looking up for African Americans who were hopeful to cast their votes at the ballot. The progress continued as nearly 20 years later, the ruling in Smith v. Allwright in 1944 struck down the Democratic Party of Texas's white-only primaries, declaring this action as unconstitutional. This, combined with the multiple civil rights acts, the first in 1957, which allowed for the prosecution of any elected officials that were interfering with voting rights, then the 1960 Act, which strengthened the oversight of fair elections, and finally in 1964, led by Martin Luther King Jr., the final Civil Rights Act banned discrimination in public places and employment.
Combined with the aforementioned legislation and Supreme Court rulings, key figures and groups played monumental roles in taking steps towards equal voting rights. The most prevalent proved to be the NAACP, which mainly focused on legal battles against racial injustice, which led by Thurgood Marshall, and their efforts played a huge role, highlighting by their efforts in Brown v. Board of Education. Marshall would later go on to become the first African American Supreme Court Justice. The legendary Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, played a huge role leading the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which used religion to peacefully protest their cause. Other activists such as Rosa Parks and Amelia Boynton Robinson had key roles in organizing protests and being actively involved in the civil rights movement. Many of these activists play roles in key events in the journey to to voting rights for African Americans. Examples such as the Freedom Summer Registration campaign in Mississippi, which sadly saw the death of 3 civilian right workers, and Dr. King's Selma to Montgomery marches in March of 1965. This effort proved to be the final straw, as on August 4th, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, finally putting an end to the countless obstacles that obstructed Black voters from participating in elections.
The effects of the Voting Rights Act were felt shortly thereafter in southern states, as factors such as the literacy tests were not used as a ploy to keep the Black population away from the ballots. For example, according to Valuing the Vote, from the passage of the Act to 1968, voter registration in areas that had previously had literacy tests had an increase of 19% in terms of registration among Black people. In Mississippi specifically, from August to September in 1965, Black voter registration went up from 35,000 to over 77,000 voters in just 1 month. This had a profound effect on Black representation, as just like white people, African Americans voted the candidate into office that they believe would implement their own personal views effectively. This is especially true with Mississippi, as in 1971, there were already 50 African Americans that filled positions within Mississippi government, a monumental increase. Overall, by the end of 1965, just 4 months after the passing of the Voting Rights Act by President Lyndon B. Johnson, the southern states as a whole had seen 250,000 new registered voters, a truly seismic shift in political participation for African Americans. Since the creation of the country in 1776, up until the passage of the Voting Rights Act, there was a total of 5 African Americans elected to Congress, 2 into the U.S. Senate by the names of Hiram Revels, who was elected in Mississippi in 1870, and Blanche Bruce, who was elected to Mississippi 5 years later. And there had been 3 elected African Americans into the House of Representatives, the first being Joseph Rainey to South Carolina in 1870, Robert Smalls also to South Carolina in 1874, and Benjamin Turner in Alabama in 1871. The key similarity between these 5 men was that they were all elected during the Reconstruction period that took place before Jim Crow laws, which were implemented in 1877, meaning that after this, there was no African American congressman in the South until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, further showing the true importance of this act. Conversely, when looking at the number of congressmen from the time of the passage of the Voting Rights Act in August of 1965 to the 2020 presidential election, the amount of African American congressmen in the southern part of the United States has reached a total of 163, with numbers still predicted to soar in the following years. Overall, through efforts from extraordinary activists, groups, elected officials, presidents, and many different communities, the journey from the depths of Jim Crow laws in the late 19th century to the promised free, fair voting rights for Black people in the South found a happy ending with the passing of the Voting Rights Act on August 4th, 1965, an ending which has and will continue to shape the nation today and into the future.